great. So hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this roundtable discussion hosted at LMU as part of the South Asian Studies Association conference. And we are very grateful for the opportunity to discuss a topic that's very close to us, which is Kashmir Shaivism, also referred to as non-dual Tantric Shaivism, a profound tradition which originated well over 1,000 years ago in the mountains and valleys of Kashmir. So I chose the title 1,000 Years of Kashmir Shaivism to emphasize the historicity and the enduring influence of this profound way of life and practice. And today we will be exploring its civilizational links with the rest of Bharat, India, the esoteric and philosophical aspects of non-dual Tantra and its resurgence in the 20th century. So today we have with us three eminent speakers whose body of work speaks for itself. We have Professor Shonaleeka Kaul and Professor Subhash and Shri Sunil Raina. And each of them will be bringing their own unique perspective to this discussion. So, without further ado, I will let each one of you introduce yourself and your area of work, and then we can proceed with your opening address, and then after which we can engage with each other more freely. So, Shonaleeka ji, would you like to begin?
Certainly. So you would like me to introduce myself and then go on directly to some of my opening comments?
Yes, please.
Certainly. So, Namaskar. I am a cultural and intellectual historian of early India who specializes in working with Sanskrit literature. I am associate professor at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, India. And I'm also the author of The Making of Early Kashmir, Landscape and Identity in the Rajtarangini, and the editor and translator of a work called Looking Within, Life Lessons from Lal Ded, the Shaiva mystic from Kashmir. It's a great pleasure to be speaking here today. And like I said, I am a historian. So I would like to today place Kashmir Shaivism in a bit of its historical geographical context rather than a theological one. This is not only because we have Subhash ji, Sunil ji, and Vikram ji to go into the philosophical content and the details of Kashmir Shaivism, but also because apart from the details and the micro picture, there is perhaps a need to remind ourselves of the big picture, the wider context which perhaps produced Kashmir Shaivism, and in which context Kashmir was not alone. Let us begin, however, by noting that while Kashmir Shaivism, or even devotional Shiva Dvait, as some call it, originated no later than the 8th century CE, Shiva Shakti worship itself, that is, Shaiva Shaktism in Kashmir, dates back much earlier. If we go just by material evidence, even then at least the 2nd century CE, as glimpsed in some incredibly detailed and beautiful iconography on gold coins from that period that clearly depict Shiva, Trishula or trident in hand, and tiger sprawled at his feet. And the coins also label him as Ishu, Ishan, Ishu. In addition, colossal Banalingas and Ekamukhalingas, as well as sculptures of Maheshwara as Bhuteshwara, which was the unique Kashmiri iconographic innovation in the representation of Shiva, and sculptures of members of Shiva's divine family, such as Parvati, Ganesha, and Kartikeya, are all also to be found in the valley from at least the 5th century CE onwards. And a little later, we are also getting images of Harihara, the conjoined Shiva and Vishnu representation, Trimurti, which would be Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, but also sometimes the three Rupas of Shiva himself, multi-armed Durga Mahishasur Mardinis, including the splendid 18-armed Durga Mahishasur Mardini from Tengapura, who was recently returned to India from abroad where she had been smuggled, and assorted Matrikas like Chamunda. We are getting splendid representations of all of these from the Shaiva Shakt pantheon from at least the middle of the first millennium CE. In fact, the Nilmath Puran, composed in Sanskrit in the 8th century CE, and the earliest extant account of Kashmir's origins and sacred geography, tells us that Kashmir was founded from a primordial lake where none other than Sati, that is the consort of Shiva or Shakti herself, resided. This was the Sati Saras, as the text tells us. Now, the Nilmath, as well as Kalhan's Rajtarangini, which is the earliest surviving history of Kashmir from the 12th century, unambiguously state that the valley of Kashmir is Parvati herself, and the king of Kashmir is but a portion of Shiva. So it says, Kashmiraha Parvati Raja Tatra Haransha Jaha Gyeyo, Hara Ansha, Haransha Jaha, a part of Shiva. I will return later, perhaps in comments, to this embeddedness of Shaiva Shaktism in the very land of Kashmir and its implications for her selfhood and indeed her place consciousness. But for now, to continue the story, alongside this theistic and iconographic or Saguna form of Shaiva Shaktism, there developed a deeply monist or Nirguna strand of philosophy in Kashmir that identifies Shiva as pure consciousness. This school that came to be called Pratyabhigya, recognition, or Trika, the triad of Shiva, Shakti, and Nara, or Krama, succession of stages of realization, was represented in the works of great scholar Siddhas like Bhattanarayan in the 8th century, Utpaladev in the 9th century, Abhinav Gupta, the doyen synthesizer of aesthetics and metaphysics in the end 10th and early 11th century, and Shitikantha in the 13th century. Later, Laldyad or Laleshwari in the 14th century, whose famous Vaks or sayings in the vernacular Kashmiri devoted to her great love for Paramashiva belong to this long line of realized souls, as did Rupa Bhavani in the 17th century and Sri Lakshmanju in the 20th century, who espoused the same continuous tradition well into our times. But what was this tradition? Though it is difficult to render this highly sophisticated thought in simple terms, we can say that according to Trika, all of creation is replete with one indivisible superconsciousness called Paramashiva, the supreme principle, as it were. And Shakti, primeval energy, if you like, is its principle of creation, Vimarshini. Spontaneously realizing this truth, this anuttara, this unsurpassed reality, is moksha, is liberation. But human beings do not realize this, since their intellect is clouded by delusions, maya, or amnesia induced by a sensory and material life. So this kind of life makes them mistakenly identify themselves with their worldly forms and roles, or samsara, causing them a great deal of suffering in the process and obscuring their real identity, which is one with God, who is formless, nameless, pure consciousness. So Kashmir Shaivism may sound sectarian, but it is ultimately pointing to a Paramashiva who is nameless, formless, pure consciousness. Trika recommended a simple and spontaneous, sarala sahaja, recognition or pratyabhigya of this ultimate reality by turning inwards into the self. Because Shiva himself is subtle and spontaneous and resides within us. Thus, the path of Trika was actually Nishpatha Patha, a pathless path, in which through God's grace alone and simply an intent concentration on the self via observing the inflow and outflow of one's breath, which is called the Ajapa Gayatri, the natural mantra. Just this led to the direct experience or anubhava of the ultimate consciousness, which is first envisioned as the union of Shiva and Shakti. Thus, moksha or liberation in Trika was simply self-realization, an expansion of the indivisible self to include the whole of creation by seeing beyond all dualities and differences, bheda. Hence, Trika as abheda, which is the ultimate advaita, the ultimate non-duality. And also pointing, by the way, to the incredible inclusivism of Kashmir Shaivism, which advocates rising above or being able to see beyond differences. So pure consciousness thus experienced, according to the early exponents of Trika, was a state of blissful and radiant freedom, which was nothingness. Shunya ati shunya. As Laleshwari put it, practices, tantra, gave way to knowledge, mantra. Knowledge dissolved into consciousness. When consciousness dissolved, nothing remained. Nothingness dissolved into nothingness. Now, anyone familiar with the hugely influential, dare I say, defining Indic tradition of Vedanta, that is, with the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras from at least 1,000 years before Common Era, the first text to speak of consciousness, Chitta, or Brahmana, and liberation as unity of the self, Atman, with Brahmana. These are the first texts to speak about this. And later their bhashyas or their commentaries by Shankaracharya, that Advaitin par excellence in the 8th or 9th century. Or anyone familiar with the still later popular Nirguna Gnostic traditions associated with Kabir, for example, in Banaras. The Nathapanthis like Matsyendranath and Gorakhnath in the Ganga plains, again starting 8th or 9th century. Or the Veerashaiva Yakka Mahadevi in Karnataka. Or even, if I may extend this, Nanak in Punjab, who spoke of Ek Omkara, and Namadev in Maharashtra, who sees Vithala. So he doesn't name it as Shiva, but he speaks of Vithala as precisely this absolute, this supreme absolute. All of these traditions espouse this simple, spontaneous, non-ritualistic, deep devotion to a God, culminating in union with the supreme absolute who was Nirguna. So anyone who is actually conversant with or familiar with these traditions will have no difficulty perhaps in recognizing that Kashmir Shaivism, its doctrinal and expressive particularities apart. So let me underline that. Keeping aside the expressive particularities of Kashmir Shaivism, I think there can be no doubt that Trika was but a regional efflorescence or a regional offshoot of a pan-Indic monist consciousness. And this is the larger historical context within which I began today by urging that we understand the emergence of Kashmir Shaivism. For while there is no dearth of metaphysical studies on Trika, it may perhaps be fair to say that some of the scholarship has tended to treat of Kashmir Shaivism in a historical vacuum, making of it something of an esoteric, even exotic exhibit, or a self-contained cultural isolate in all its uniqueness. I dare say this emphasis on uniqueness converges with the manner in which the region of Kashmir herself has been misunderstood and misrepresented in historiography in the last 200 years as a secluded, insular, and thereby a unique cultural formation that somehow had no truck with the supra region, which is with the Indic mainland. Now, as I have shown in my book, The Making of Early Kashmir, it is simply unhistorical and untrue to speak of an isolated and unique Kashmir. Let me clarify. Kashmir is as unique as any and every region of this incredibly diverse country called India. But to suggest that her uniqueness stemmed from an isolation from the Indic mainstream in history is simply false. Because there is an overabundance of evidence, material and textual, empirical and discursive, to urge our moving away from what I call the unique history paradigm to the connected histories paradigm for Kashmir and the rest of India, if we are to truly understand the birth and emergence of Kashmir as a culture region, and indeed the birth of Kashmir Shaivism. There is no time for details today, they're all there in the book, but suffice it here to say that from at least the 5th century BCE onwards, that is from the dawn of civilization in the valley, till at least the 12th century CE, all cultural markers in Kashmir. What do I mean? Archaeology, textual representations, foreign accounts, inscriptions, coins, languages, art, religion, philosophy, all of them speak to a Kashmir that was open, plural, and cosmopolitan rather than isolated and insular. And a Kashmir that was overwhelmingly Indic in her genesis and composition. In fact, we see a constant synchrony with other regions of India, both near and far, and very deep and extensive, very real connections, and what are called mutual entanglements, to use a word from Connected Histories, between Kashmir and not just her neighboring areas like Punjab and Himachal, but with centers of Indic civilization in the deep interiors of India, like Patna in Bihar, Nalanda, Gaya, Banaras, Allahabad, Mathura, Malwa in central India, Gaud, Bengal in East India, Assam in northeast India, right down till Karnataka, Kuntala, which is Telangana, and Tamil Nadu in the far south. Here was cultural transmission and communication of astonishing reach and multilinear character. So it wasn't a one-way stream, it was actually at least multilinear, the very context in which we are to understand the birth of something like Kashmir Shaivism. Because Kashmiris looked to these other parts of India for a whole range of things, from politics. For example, do we know that Kashmir was a part of pan-Indic political formations right from the beginning, namely the Mauryan Empire, and it is Ashok Maurya from Magad, if you please, who is supposed to have founded the capital of Srinagar, of Kashmir, which is Srinagari. Not to mention the Indic kingdoms of the Kushanas and the Hunas later and so on. Not to mention the kings and queens and courtiers of Kashmir were also actually drawn from different parts of India. We only need to read the Raj Tarangani with some care to adduce all this massive evidence. So Kashmir looked to the rest of India for politics, trade, education, asylum, employment, art, religion, philosophy, aesthetics, fashion. You actually have Kannada haute couture in the court of Srinagar in 11th century under King of Harsha. Mind-boggling cosmopolitanism from that early in Kashmir's history. Also, pilgrimage is something that connected Kashmir with the rest of India, while people from different parts of the subcontinent turned to Kashmir for these very same reasons. And indeed, underlying this intense connectivity between Kashmir and the rest of India was the crucial historical process of migrations, both into and out of Kashmir over the centuries, with singular implications for Kashmir's demography and culture. But this has been completely ignored by the unique history paradigm. What am I talking about? Not only were kings, queens, and courtiers at Srinagar drawn variously over the centuries from Punjab, Assam, Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Kangra, Mathura, Malwa, and Karnataka, bringing with them their own traditions and their own people, but a mixed bag of commoners as well. Students, poets, pilgrims, baniyas, to use a term from the Rajtarangini, graziers, ritualists, and of course, Brahmins and bhikkhus are seen being settled. Where are they from? From Madhya Desha, that is the Gangetic Plains, Dravida Desha, southern India, Gaud, Bengal, Gandhara, Peshawar, Saurashtra, and Lat, which is Gujarat. Bhikkhus and Brahmins from here being seen settled in large numbers by several kings of Kashmir or flocking to it on their own throughout the centuries. And in corollary to this forgotten history of Kashmir, we also see Kashmiris moving out to other parts of India throughout history. This included again kings and ministers who turned towards Banaras and Prayag on abdication or on exile, and Kashmiri generals on the one hand, or scholars and literateurs. I'm thinking of people like Bilhana in the 11th century, or Mahapandit Shakyashri Bhadra in the 13th century, who incidentally is described as Kache Panchin by the Tibetans, Kashmiri Pandit. So Bilhana and Shakyashri Bhadra are examples of Kashmiris who took up employment either in courts as far south as the Deccan in Kalyan under the Western Chalukyas, or in universities as far east as Vikramashila and Udantapuri in Bihar. And then through the 12th and 15th centuries, we are also getting inscriptions from Srirangam, Chidambaram, that Shaiva center par excellence in Tamil Nadu, Tiruvarayur, again in Tamil Nadu, Kalahasti in Andhra, and among several other places, inscriptions that are fascinatingly speaking of original natives of Kashmir Desha, now resident as landed persons holding high official posts in the south. So here is historical attestation of Kashmir's openness and these intensive migrations and cross connections between Kashmir and the rest of India as far south as Tamil Nadu. And of course, we know it is popularly believed that Saraswat Brahmins migrated from Kashmir to other parts of India, especially the Konkan coast. So when you see all of this, is there any wonder really that Kashmiri culture for over 2000 years from its inception should have resonated with the Indic and vice versa? There's so many examples, I obviously can't go into them here, but let me just give you one episode from the Rajtarangini, where we hear of Kashmiri pilgrims frequenting the holy site of Gaya in Bihar for obsequies in such large numbers that the Rajtarangini tells us a Kashmiri minister in the 9th century actually sought tax exemption for Kashmiris from the local ruler of Gaya. Why am I singling out this episode? Because it, to my mind, perhaps aptly symbolizes early Kashmiri identity, which seemed to consist in a distinct regional self-awareness in the midst of an overarching subscription to all India beliefs and practices. And Kashmiris seem to wear their local and universal affiliations with pride and ease. There is no conflict between the two that is reflected in the sources. And it is at this historical intersection that I submit the origins of Kashmir Shaivism lie. This intense mix of the Indic universal and the local. I want to conclude by giving two outstanding historical examples of this positionality of Kashmir, specifically vis-a-vis Shaiva Shaktism. Very quickly. One, the Sharada Peeth, which lent her name to Kashmir as Sharada Desha. The Sharada Peeth, or the Sharada temple dedicated to Shakti Saraswati, at present, of course, lying derelict in Pak-occupied Kashmir, was once thronged by devotees from as far as Bengal in the 8th century, as early as that, and is listed by Al-Biruni in the 11th century as among the top 3 shrines of the entire Al-Hind, of the entire Indian subcontinent. And till today, some daily Hindu prayers in Tamil Nadu intriguingly begin with the invocation, Sharda Devi Kashmir Purvasini Namastute. Salutations to the goddess Sharda of Kashmir. So pre-modern Indic connectivity and Shaiva Shakt Kashmir's role in it are truly astonishing. And this is best captured perhaps by the second and last symbolic example that I want to give you, fittingly of the great 8th century seer, the seer intellectual, the Advaitin, Shankaracharya. His 3 philosophical Digvijayas, his tours of conquest across the length and breadth of this country. Now, each time setting out on these Digvijayas from his home in Kaladi in Kerala, that is in the far south of India, he consciously chose none other than Kashmir. Again, the Sharada Peeth, which he calls the Sarvagya Peetha, the seat of all omniscience, as the fitting culmination of his Advaitic travels. This is no coincidence. And the ancient Shaiva Shankaracharya temple at Srinagar that still stands till today is witness to this epic visit, or to the local memory of this epic visit, as much as to the astonishing centrality of Shaiva Shakta Kashmir to the imagination of the rest of India, and vice versa. I will pause my comments here and return perhaps after the others have come in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shonaleeka ji. That was most illuminating. And thanks for shedding light on the connected histories of Kashmir with the rest of the subcontinent. I mean, we are all aware of it, but the kind of detail that you provided, the texture, including the haute couture that was in vogue at the time, I mean, is most fascinating. In fact, I'm going to go read up on that as soon as we are done here. So Subhash ji, I know the two of us have had a number of online sessions discussing the esoteric and the philosophical aspects of Tantric Shaivism and non-dual Tantra. And, we have also, Shonaleeka ji was talking about the pan-Indic nature of Shaivism and Shaktism, and the connectedness of Kashmir to the rest of India. But I know you and me have talked about how many of these traditions traveled far outside of India and can be found as far as China and remote areas in China and other places in the Far East and Central Asia. So may I request that let us first, if you'd like to begin with that thread, Subhash ji, and then we can talk a little bit about the philosophical elements of Shaiva Tantra and what is known as Trika Shastra or Kashmir Shaivism. And maybe Kashmir Shaivism, like Shonaleeka ji said, it sounds isolated and it sounds sectarian, but we call it that because it originated in the valley, not because it's not connected to the rest of the subcontinent or even the rest of Asia for that matter. So Subhash ji, on to you, please.
Thank you very much, Vikram ji. Since you also wanted us to introduce ourselves,
yes.
Briefly, I'm a professor of computer science, electrical engineering, and physics. But for many, many years, I've also worked on history of science and particularly Indian literature and astronomy and mathematics and cognitive science within the Indian tradition. So I've done a lot of work on that. And more recently, my technical research, I also work on consciousness science, this new science that's emerging at the interface of psychology, neuroscience, physics, and computation. So I also work on that, and quantum mechanics. So that in itself has linkages, if you will, with the very nature and epistemology, and if you will, even ontology of Kashmir Shaivism. So there are many of these threads that have sort of come together in my studies, and some of those I did have the opportunity to discuss with Vikram on his podcast a few months ago. So, so what do I want to emphasize today? First of all, I was very pleased to hear Shonaleeka's presentation on the various ways Kashmir has been connected to rest of India. And this whole framing of Kashmir as something unique and different is in line with the broader framing of India as something unique and different that Indologists have done for 200 or 300 years, to the disappointment, if you will, of great scholars like Anand Kumaraswamy or a sadhak like Sri Aurobindo. Anand Kumaraswamy, of course, saying that literally everything that's been written up by Western Indologists and their Indian followers on the nature of Hinduism is incorrect. That's what he said in his famous book, Hinduism and Buddhism, which came out, I think, in the 1930s. He says literally everything is wrong. This whole anthropological view of India, of Indian tradition and Indian knowledge systems is incorrect. And in my own studies, I sort of have arrived at similar understandings, and I believe he is right on. And so I did totally resonate with what Shonaleeka said about her interpretation of or her view of the writings on or situating Kashmir as being totally false and not in consonance with reality. Now, I just want to pick up on 2 or 3 threads. First of all, while Shonaleeka spoke about connections with the Indian subcontinent, there are also these very powerful connections with Central Asia and East Asia, and further to the west, beyond Samarkand and Bukhara to the Slavic world. Shonaleeka spoke about Ashoka Maurya and how it's believed that Ashoka was responsible for setting up of an Indian colony, if you will, in Khotan. So when you look northwards from Kashmir and look at Khotan and the whole Darem Basin, the whole of what is Xinjiang right now, and there are many cities there. And as we know, the languages that were used in that part of the world were Middle Indo-Aryan, as well as, of course, Khotanese and what's been called hybrid Buddhist Sanskrit. And there was a tremendous interest in that part of the world and beyond in China on the ideas that were converging in Kashmir, representing thought and movement, if you will, in the entire subcontinent, and going beyond. And we see examples of that in iconography all across Central Asia and in China and elsewhere. And in the many different ways, it influenced religion, in worship, in literature. And in fact, Victor Meyer, the well-known sinologist from University of Pennsylvania, has argued that in the middle of the first millennium CE, about 30 to 35,000 Chinese words evolved out of Sanskrit. And they are now so much a part of Chinese language that most people are not aware of their origin. Or even now, of course, we also had scholars like Kumarajiv, who had such a powerful influence on Chinese religion, on Mahayana as practiced in China. even now, the Lotus Sutra, which is recited in China, is really Kumarajiva's version. And that was a version which had a huge side of Vedanta thrown in. So it was not the doctrinaire shunyata. It was where the whole framework took literally all the divinities which represent our understanding of reality, as in Kashmir Shaivism or in Vedanta, and made it a part of the mainstream religion in the Far East. And so that even now, one of the most popular chants in all of Asia, East Asia, and Japan and Korea and Vietnam is Nilakantha Dharani, where Nilakantha, Shiva, is worshipped by Avalokiteshvara as the exemplar of compassion, because Avalokiteshvara is supposed to be the Bodhisattva who represents compassion, but Avalokiteshvara himself is worshipping Nilakantha for having swallowed the halahal poison, which emerges in Amrit Manthan or Samudra Manthan, to save the entire universe. And Nilakantha Dharani, of course, also invokes Harihara. So it also invokes Narasimha. So it also invokes Vishnu. So we see that the confluence, if we were to see it from the lens situated in Kashmir, and then since Kashmir geographically was the doorway to Central Asia and beyond, so we see all of these ideas and iconography and imagery, including that of Krishna. You'll be surprised in Xinjiang, and going all from there all over Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and so this is something that people have not been generally aware of. But further to the west, even the Zoroastrians incorporated Maheshwara into their pantheon in Samarkand and Bukhara, and further beyond, we see in the Slavic world the greatest divinity of the Slavic world, which of whom the shrine or the place where the worship was focused in the Baltics is the worship of Shvetovid. Shvetovid, the Sanskrit etymology of the knower of light, and as we know, Shiva is also Prakasha, is light, and Shakti is Vimarsha, or reality is Vimarsha, which is illuminated by light. So the greatest divinity of the Slavic world was Shvetovid. And it had, just like the Mukhalingas of Shiva, it had 4 faces. The northern face was called Svarog, or like Svarga. The western face was Parkonis or Parjanya. The southern face was Lada, which is another name for earth, and the eastern face was Mokosh or Moksha. So we see that this was, and in addition to that, you also had other divinities like Shiva Bhaga. As we know, divinity in the Slavic world is called Bhaga or Bog. So we had Shiva Bog and Rudra Bog and so on. So all the divinities, or a very large number of them, from the Indian subcontinent. Now, of course, there are 2 ways of looking at it. You could say that they were all a continuation of the Indo-European divinities. But then once one sees that the particular innovations, and these innovations, for example, if one were to look at Kashmir Shaivism itself as an innovation, we see the divinities in the Slavic world as a continuation of these innovations, and it's much harder to see them as being remnants of something much earlier. Now, my own studies or work on the Vedic system or Vedic sciences make me feel very strong about the view that Kashmir Shaivism is just a retelling, if you will, of a understanding which is already a part of the Vedic system. The Vedic system as Vidya, the Trika of Kashmir Shaivism, is really a restating of the Vidya. Vidya, for example, in the Gayatri mantra of Bhu, Bhuva, and Swaha as the earth or the body, the atmosphere or the intermediate region, and the Swara or the sun, which is beyond, or the heavens. And you have exactly the same as in Apara, Para, Para, and Para, the three regions with their corresponding goddesses that we have in Kashmir Shaivism. So this triple view of reality is certainly central to the Vedic view, and now this triple view, of course, can be seen either from the perspective of the Anu, or of the Pinda, or the body. And as we know in the Shiva Sutras, there are these three upayas: the Anava upaya, which is the upaya related to the body, which is where you as an individual who's an embodiment, embodying the multiplicity that emerges from the one, from your point, from your perspective, you can then reach that unity from your part of the multiplicity that is emerged. You can travel backwards, or you can do it through Shaktopaya, which is through a representation, or through a point where you've sort of left your mind-centered experience, and you go on to a flow which represents the movement of Shakti. And these movements, of course, can be seen in a variety of ways, through Krama, for example, the 12 Kalis, the cognitions as they emerge, or certainly prior to that, you have that in the Panchananas, the 5 faces of Shiva himself, from the Sadyojata, the newly born cognition, to the next one is the Aghora, which is the cognition, which is, of course, you're using the word Aghora, but it relates to the heat that is generated, because light has 2 aspects: heat, which is its more primordial aspect, and then the illuminating aspect, which is, if you represent this as a dual, which represents Rudra and Shiva, the frightening aspect. Heat is also frightening, it can burn you, or the auspicious aspect. So you have Sadyojata, then Aghora, then Tat Purush, which is where it's hidden within us. And then you have Vamadeva, which is where the beginning of insight emerges through recognition of the dual, which is the Vamadeva. And you can see it in so many different ways, either through aesthetics, because aesthetics brings in beauty, which is the beginning of the inner opening of the inner eye. And that is something that's been emphasized so much within the tradition, with its focus on the arts and music and poetry, as we see in the work of Bharata, or in Vishnu Dharmottar Purana, which is one of those great Puranas, which is a encyclopedia of the arts, which is supposedly written in Kashmir. Vamadeva, and in iconography, Vamadeva is represented often by Parvati. And then finally, the fifth phase of Ishana, which is the phase which represents Anugraha. Because if the three upayas as given to us in the Shiva Sutras itself, the Arnava Upaya, the Shakta Upaya, which is where you travel outside of the confines of yourself, which you can focus on either through mantra or your japa or whatever your other mind-centered sadhana may be, and you travel beyond that, so beyond your body. And for that, people in their inner practice look at it very variously. And the outer is mirrored in the inner, so you can see it through the various chakras and through the Mahabhutas, which each of these is associated with a certain cognition. So there are many different practices that emerge out of this. And finally, the Shambhu Upaya, which is the Upaya associated with Ishana, that particular form of Shiva, or Anugraha, the grace that descends on you, and then you are a part. So you travel beyond that separation. You view these firstly from one come two, and then you see it as three, which are the Traividya. And then within you are normally the Anu. So you are the body, and then through the travel through the intermediate region, through pranas, or you have the five koshas, the Annamaya-kosha. So then in your travel up, you go to Pranamaya-kosha. So that's your breath. You can do part of your practice through your breath, or Manomaya-kosha, which is where you can use your mind for your practice, or then you travel further up to Vijnanamaya-kosha or Anandamaya-kosha. But all of these koshas are ultimately illuminated by the Atman or Shiva, which resides beyond. Now what's interesting, of course, is that all of this is totally central to the Vedic vision, going as far back as one can, no matter what kind of a chronology you use. Certainly the earliest Upanishads, or in the Samhita itself, you have all of these. You can, at different places, you can find the key ideas, the idea of Dwa Suparna, the two birds, the two golden birds, which are on the branch, which are the two selves within us. The one which is the conditioned self, represented by our normal awareness of the mind, and the other self who just looks, which is the Sakshi within. So all of that goes back to the Rig Veda Samhita itself, and how within, or you look at Krishna's great dialogue in the Bhagavad Gita, where he speaks of certainly he says he is Smriti, Jnana, and Apohan. This is 15:15. that he is memory, knowledge, and forgetting of that, which is what makes us not be aware, for which you need pratyabhigya, because you have forgotten what your true self is. You've forgotten that is Shivoham, that one is Shiva, that one is truly one's consciousness. So, and then in the vritti on pratyabhigya, you have Utpal Deva speak of how reality can be perceived as jnana, smriti, and apohan. And these represent two different perspectives on reality. In the Vaishnav tradition, the smriti seems to come prior to knowledge, while in the Shaiva tradition, knowledge, because one is focusing, looking at it from top down, Shiva comes in first, and then from which comes smriti, because that's what makes it possible for one to have smriti. And then because of apohan, because of one's forgetting, because our normal conditioned nature is that related to our body, and body is fixed by instincts and by its biology, which is why we are bound, or pashas bind us to our nature, our normal nature, which is why we need mukti. So, which is why Pashupati, Shiva as Pashupati, its invocation within us gives us freedom. We cut these pashas and discover that we are really Shiva. And you know, as a brief commentary on what's happening in the West, as we see in the West, there is great despair, you know, in the light of the most unprecedented prosperity and access to information and knowledge. Just last year, 92,000 young Americans died of drug overdose. Why is that happening? Because the Western view of reality is Annamaya-kosha primarily, which is the body, and Pranamaya-kosha and Manomayakosha, because they emerge out of the body. That is what the Western ontology is. And then you can have some sense of beauty and happiness, but related to the body from bottom up, through the arts, to the extent that people can do that arts, but that's all become synthetic. Now you don't even see the performers in the real world, because everything has become virtual. And this disconnect from one's true self, from one's Shiva, is what is the cause of this great despair. Now, as a practicing scientist as well, I can tell you that even the sciences have come to a great crisis. In physics itself, 99.5% of reality cannot be explained. And for that, dark matter and dark energy are being invoked, for which there is not the slightest shred of evidence. And in neuroscience, there's no sense of as to where the source of awareness inside the brain resides, because it doesn't reside at any single point. So just to conclude, I think I might be running out of time. To conclude, what we have at this point, a great convergence of the search that modern science has done over the past 200 years, and has reached a point where the search of consciousness is absolutely central. And that's precisely what Kashmir Shaivism, as one of the ways in which the Vedic epiphany, if you will, or Vedic understanding of reality emerge, come together. It's the complement. Now, of course, there are those who say, why is it that people could have known, the sages could have known what they've written about, because that is totally mind-boggling and extraordinary. But that's because consciousness is one, while its manifestation as vimarsha or prakriti is many. In order to know many, you have to go through a path. That's where physical or outer sciences or the apara vidyas are progressive. They are step and step and step. But the knowledge of para is one. It occurs in one step. And that's why that mystical, esoteric knowledge informs one's intuition in ways which are truly extraordinary. And that's what the promise of Kashmir Shaivism is. Thank you.
Thank you, Subhash ji. That was an extraordinarily detailed exposition of the Trika Shastra, and the way I love the way you linked it with modern consciousness studies. And in fact, it is almost, it is misleading to call this a religion or a sectarian way of life, because if you look at it, it's pure universality, and it's very, very scientific in the way that it is structured for each aspirant to reach the ultimate goal. And it's crafted so that people of all personality types and different stages in their evolutionary journey can partake of it. So whether you want to jump into the deep end of the pool or take baby steps in the shallow part of the pool, it's all there, it's all available for us to partake of. So thank you so much for that. We'll come back to that a little later. And now I want to introduce Sunil Raina. He's a friend of mine. I met him in Srinagar when I was living there. And he is a devotee of Swami Lakshmanju, who was largely responsible, and his guru Swami Ram, for the resurgence of Kashmir Shaivism, the Trika Shastras in the 20th century, because it had sort of faded away in the place of its birth, Kashmir, after the 14th century, because of influx from outside and new kind of traditions that were introduced, and the old ways were no longer given the importance that they were. So Sunil Raina is a chronicler. He publishes a magazine, and he visits Kashmir frequently, and he's going to tell us about Shaivism as it exists today. And in its contemporary form, he's going to show us the sites, these ancient sites in Kashmir as they look today, and his own experiences, and a little bit about Swami Lakshmanju and his influence on the Western Academy. And so I'll let Sunil take it from here. Sunil, kindly introduce yourself to our viewers, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Vikramji, for inviting me for today's talk. I would like to also compliment Subhaji and Shonaleeka ji for giving a very one of the brilliant talks. Share my presentation for today's talk, which I have prepared so that people could understand contemporary Kashmir. So I think, is the slides visible to you?
Yes, it's visible. Yes.
So, brief about me is that I am a engineer by education, but passionate about Kashmir and Kashmiri Shaivism. So, in fact, I must say that it's by the will of Lord Shiva that I have been learning the Kashmiri Shaivism under the tutelage of various masters, especially by the grace of Swamiji Maharaj. So, let me come back to
Hi, Sunil. It seems like your internet.
Shaivism. I would also like to people.
Sunilji, voice is breaking. Sunilji.
Here that from last couple of years we have been instrumental. We and many of my friends have been instrumental in celebrating the Jayanti of a great Shaivite, Abhinav Gupta. And in one of the programs, Subhaji had also graced us. So now coming to my presentation, I would like to share some of the slides regarding the 1,000 years of Kashmir Shaivism.
Yes, if we can pause for just 1 second. I think if you turn your video off, it typically helps with internet bandwidth.
Can you?
Has he dropped out of the meeting? Vikram, if you can help interject, it typically helps any of the presenters having internet issues. If we turn the video off, it helps with streaming bandwidth.
Yeah, I'm just contacting him.
Okay, perfect.
I'll just talk to him right now.
And then also, if it's helpful, I can share the slides from my section, and then he can just be like a voice, whichever is easiest.
हाँ आपका थोड़ा voice weak आ रहा था, cracking up हो रहा था. So they were saying that if you stop your video, then the audio will be stronger. तो पता नहीं अगर आपका okay.
So, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. So, Kashmir, as already explained by Shonaleeka, that is a land. So, Kashmir had been the synthesis of various ideologies at various schools. So, it's mostly known as the land of Tantra. And in Kashmir, we call it as Devi Angan, the playground of the great goddess. So in this playground, we have the great masters which came up in 20th century, like Swami Ram, Swami Mehta Kakji, and Swami Lakshmanju. So before I go further, I would like to invoke their blessings for this presentation. Now, Swami Ramji was the instrumental saint
Not audible, Sunil ji.
हाँ, तो आपका बहुत वीक सिग्नल है क्या? प्रॉब्लम क्या है? अच्छा, क्योंकि वॉइस आपका नहीं आ रहा है यार, बिल्कुल नहीं आ रहा है.
The other option we could try is
अच्छा,
giving.
तो मैं शेयर कर दूं अपने स्क्रीन पे. तो कैसे करना है उसको? हाँ, क्योंकि टाइम भी खत्म हो रहा है ना, इसीलिए. हाँ, तो क्योंकि फिर हम आप ट्राई करेंगे क्या फिर से? आपका इंटरनेट आपने चेक नहीं किया था? अच्छा, ठीक है. ओके. Okay, so Sunil is fixing his internet. I think he's got some technical issues. So he asked me to, continue with Subhash ji and with Shonaleeka. So Shonaleeka ji, are you there? Because you wanted to come back to some of your earlier comments. So maybe we can go to that until Sunil fixes his technical issues.
Certainly.
So please, please
Certainly,
continue.
Certainly,
Yeah.
it's a pity that we couldn't continue. Maybe he'll come back and we can hear Sunilji again. But I can perhaps carry on from the point he started, which is he was talking of how Kashmir is referred to as Devi Angan. So I just want to take that further because I did hint earlier in my presentation about how Shaiv Shaktism is actually intrinsic to the place consciousness of Kashmir. So it is not some construct from the outside or a top-down phenomenon or something that arises only in the 8th century and continues till a certain time. It is, in a sense, this consciousness goes beyond even the historical trajectory of Kashmir Shaivism. That is the impression I have from looking at the historical sources, which are not necessarily dealing with Kashmir Shaivism itself. The Nilmat, for example, is also a Vaishnava text. The Raj Tarangani is not a sectarian text at all. It's not a religious or theological text by far. And yet this is the construction of Kashmir we are getting there. Let me give you some examples. So Kashmir emerges in the early historical texts as almost literally the place to attain liberation, because moksha suffuses its ecology, as it were. Why am I saying that? Let me give examples. Harmukha. Now, Haramukha literally means mouth of Shiva. It happens to be a mountain, a holy mountain, 45 kilometers north of Srinagar. But right. It is also the point in the human body, the name of the point in the human body at which the Kundalini Shakti lies coiled in the Mooladhara chakra. And when awakened, can ascend to pure consciousness. So the analogy, as it were, the parallel between the Tantra, the Tantric vision of liberation, and the very land of Kashmir is hard to miss. And this continues to come through in the works of Lalleshwari, for example. Because while she is invoking the hydraulic origins of the valley, the Satisar I talked about earlier and how it is drained on the behest of sage Kashyapa to give rise to Kashmir as a land. So see how she, Lalleshwari, describes Kashmir as a bridge to salvation, but invoking this hydraulic origin. She says, I saw once the waters that flowed from the mouth of Shiva, Harmukha, to the foot of Vishnu, Vishnupada, becoming a bridge across the illusory world, Sansara. What is she doing? Now, for those who don't know, Vishnupad or Kunsarnag is 65 kilometers north of Srinagar, and Harmukh, I told you, was 45 kilometers. So this allegorical verse thus beautifully captures not just the north-south extent of Kashmir, but the complete overlap between her physical and spiritual domains, as it were. So Parvati too, we know, is associated with Kunsarnag, with the vicinity of Kunsarnag at the Naubandhana peak, which Lal is invoking here, because she is supposed to have transformed herself into a great boat now to save life forms during the deluge. So you can see all kinds of narratives are coming together to tell you the same thing about the land and the waters of Kashmir themselves resonating with Shaktism. We also know from the Nilmat, and please let me know if Sunil is back and I'll be happy to stop. We also know from the Nilmat that the many rivers of Kashmir were identified with different forms of Shakti. And chief among these is Vitasta, which is the modern Jhelum. And we have Sunil back. I'll just finish the point. These multiple rivers of Kashmir are described as Mokshadayini. So each one of them is Mokshadayini. And then by the fact that they empty into the Vitasta or they join the Vitasta, they're all deemed to constitute this joint network that purifies the entire land. So as I said in the beginning, it is the ecology to go to for moksha or liberation, because everything makes it so. Let Sunil take it from here.
Am I audible now, Shonaleeka ji?
Hanji, bilkul. You are.
Okay. So beginning from, I was here at Swami Ramji and Swami Mehtab Kakji. They were first instrumental in reviving the Kashmir Shaivism early in the 20th century. And they passed on this legacy to Ishwar Sarup Swami Laxmanju Maharaj, who not only established an ashram at Ishwar Nishad, but was instrumental in guiding many seekers, scholars, and people across the India and the globe. So why this all happened in Kashmir? Because in all over the history of the Kashmir is always referred as the playground of the goddess. And the references of it can be found in the Raj Tarangni. In the Raj Tarangni, the Pandit Kalhan mentions that there is not a space equivalent to a sesame seed, which is not a tirtha in Kashmir. That is the shloka number 1, which I have put it in the highlighted in this presentation. Similarly, the reference of the Kashmir can be found in the Mahabharata and also in the Valmiki Ramayana, especially in the Kishkinda Kand. So apart from these, the indigenous scriptures of Kashmir like the Nilmat Puran and Bringe Samhita, they also eloquently give details of the topography, the culture, and the kind of traditions which were practiced by the people in the Kashmir Valley. And Bringe Samhita is especially very important because it is like a dialogue between the Shiva and Shakti, Bhairav and Bhairavi, where the question is asked by the goddess Parvati to know about the various shrines, various tirthas of the Kashmir region, to which Lord Shiva explains her eloquently, and that are all chronicled in the form of Mahatmayas, which are coded in the Bringe Samhita. So in the first part of the Bringe Samhita also covers about the Tripur Sundari, the goddess Shri Chakreshwari, or it is also known as the goddess Tripur Sundari, which is the presiding goddess of Srinagar city. Many people, due to the folklore, they say that the Srinagar has derived its name because it has a naturally built Shri Yantra, means engraved Shri Yantra on this Shila or on this boulder. The people come and pray here. The goddess here, Shri Tripura Sundari, is guarded by 8 Bhairavas in the 8 directions of the Srinagar city. And it gives the practical demonstration of the Shri Yantra. As you can, if one can study in detail, the Tantra Loka, Mahamaheshwara Abhinav Gupta also refers about it in a different way. So whole Kashmir is kind of a practical laboratory of Trika philosophy. So where you can find various places where you can relate, and they are geographical places where one can move from the outer world to the inner world. So the journey is from outer to inner, but the first step is to go to the outer, experience it, and then absorb it and dwell within oneself, because that is the essence of the Kashmir Shaivism. So most of these Bhairava centers are activated even today and have immense power, healing, especially healing power, esoteric value, and they are the part of our folklore traditions of every Kashmiri Pandit. And you must also know that every Hindu family, every Kashmiri Pandit family in Kashmir had their clan Bhairavas and the clan goddesses, to which they were visiting, praying for their day-to-day lives, day-to-day issues, or whatever they wanted to experience or wanted to ask Supreme. All these answers, the first call was their local deities. Now, all these Bhairavas in Kashmir, they are in total 64 in number in different parts of the Kashmir Valley. And all these Bhairavas were the protecting deities, and the Kaul, we can say, as a guardian deities, which were practiced by the people, because all this tradition flowed down from the Bhairav Tantras. So as you know, the etymology of the Bhairav is Baran, Ravan, and Vaman, which means the Baran means the kind of who fulfills the things, who is the operator, or Ravan, who is the destroyer, and Vaman, who throws out, who creates the world. So that is what is Bhairav was a integral part of our Kashmir Hindu philosophy, Kashmiri Hindu society, and first call towards any other deity was made after visiting the local Bhairavas. Now, the Ashtabhairavas, which I said that the goddess and the center goddess Kashmir, which is the Shri Chakreshwari or the Lalita, or we call it Devi Sharika, is guarded by these 8 Bhairavas in 8 directions. One is the Anandeshwar Bhairav, which is at Mysoma. The other is Shitleshwar Bhairav at Habakadal, then Mangaleshwar Bhairav, then Bahukheteshwar Bhairav, then Hatkeshwar Bhairav, then Tushak Raj Bhairav, then Puran Raj Bhairav, and then Vetal Bhairav. So now I'll take you to these different places. So this is the picture of Anandeshwar Bhairav. This is the first Bhairava which was placed in the center of a Srinagar city. And the location of this temple is at near Mysuma. The Bhairava here is in the form of 18 arms. He has a concert Anandeshwari, Nandi is the vehicle, and it is in the folk traditions. And various earlier scholars like Sri Trilokinath Ganjuji, they have said that it was in the presence of this Anandeshwara temple that Mahamaheshwaracharya composed that Bhairav Stotra, which is the Vyapta Saracha. So that is why it is very important site for Shaivites. Swami Ram and various other saints used to visit this Bhairav, and he was also referred as Bhairav Raj, the head of all the Bhairavas in the Kashmir Mandala. So these are the different icons or sculptures inside this temple, where you can clearly see the Bhairav and Bhairavi in this slide. And this is how then later they were put into the a painting of it was made subsequently in later years. Now, second one is the Shitaleshwar Bhairava. You can see the different arms portrayed. There's a temple there, and the people are visiting that temple even now, although it's in a dilapidated condition because the exodus of the nearby residents now. The third Bhairava which comes in the Srinagar city is the Mangaleshwar Bhairava. This is one of the important Bhairavas because it was here that Swami Lakshmanju was initiated into the Kashmir Shaivism by Swami Mehtab Kakji, and later his Sanskrit grammarian teacher Maheshwar Razdanji also started his teaching at the presence of this temple only, at the presence of this Bhairava. So now it makes us very clear how Bhairavas were important for any education, for any kind of a good activity, any kind of eclectic activity. All the things were started with the blessings of their local Bhairava. Subsequently, in Rainavari, there's a Vedal Bhairava. He is said to be the one who is pleasing in nature and has a veena, damru, and plays all this to please the Lord Shiva. Similarly, in other parts of the Kashmir, this is the Ganga. I'm showing some of the Bhairavas where I have personally visited. So Ganganand Bhairava is at Martan because there's a Ganga flowing there. The river next to the Martan temple is known as Chaka Nadi, or which is basically coming from the Sanskrit word Chakit. So that Ganga is referred as a Ganga also, and therefore the local Bhairava is also known as Ganganand Bhairav. So I have visited there, and the people now the people who have gone back, few of the families, they offer the yellow turmeric rice on Tuesday and Saturday and invoke the blessings of the local Bhairava over there. Subsequently, in Nunnar, Gandarbal area, you can see this is the place of Devraj Bhairava there. In Badgam, you can find the Anand Bhairava. And the Shivling here is a very old one because you can see the kind of marks over in the Shivling. Subsequently, in Sumbal and Sopor, you have a Bhairava called as Nandikeshwara, who has been colored in the red form, a reddish form, which indicates his Kriya Shakti and Rajoguna. He has holding different weapons like trident, which control the 3 aspects of Shakti, like para, upper, and upper. The right upper hand is holding rosary, which indicates constant contemplation of Supreme, and a kinetic energy, which is holding. The lower left hand is holding ball of blood, indicating of the devouring the wicked, and left upper hand holding Vajra as a tool for punishment for those who create turmoil. And he said the place is in Sumbal, in the central Kashmir, and in Sopor. So people of those areas trace their origin, trace their influence to the Nandikeshwar Bhairava. Subsequently, near Nishat, near the Ishwar Ashram, you can see there's a Khemraj Bhairava, although there's a small spring there in a very bad shape now because the local residents have not been taking care of it. And some of the other Bhairavas where I have been luckily seen across the valley. So these are a few of those out of those 64 in the valley. Now, Bhairava worship was not only in the physical form or in the geographical sphere, it was also esoteric. So in the esoteric worship, it was worshipped in the form of Swachanda Bhairava. Swachanda means spontaneous. So Swachanda Bhairava was worshipped especially on Shivratri. On the Shivratri, there are 3 Bhairavas which are continuously worshipped. But one is the Vatuk Bhairava, which I'll come to in the next slide. Then is the Rama Bhairava, which is on the concluding day when we come back from the river. And in between, after propitiating the Vatuk Bhairava, the next deity to be worshipped is the Swachanda Bhairava. Here you can see the picture which has Swachanda Bhairava has 18 arms, 5 faces, Satyajit, Vamdev, Agor, and Ishan, Tatpurush. Then wearing the elephant skin. Elephant skin is here because there's a story behind it, and both on elephant skin and the tiger skin. And more details about this worship of the Swachanda is mentioned in Swachanda Tantra. So there's a separate tantra dedicated to the worship of this Swachanda Bhairava. Since the time is very limited, I will not go into the details of all of these. Now, Vatuk Bhairava is the main deity of the Shivratri. Vatuk means child in Sanskrit. So Vatuk Bhairava is worshipped in Kashmir as a primary deity on Shivratri. You can see different kinds of vessels kept here. So in these vessels, walnuts are put, and they are kept there till 3 days or 4 days as per the tithi, and worshipped on these 3 to 4 days continuously. And on the concluding day, when we immerse all these flowers and other in the river, the Rama Bhairava is invoked for his blessings. So there is a Shiva Nirnaya and story why Vatuk and why Rama Bhairava is worshipped on the Shivratri. I have written a detailed article on it, but since the time is not there, I will not go into the details of that as of now. But that's how the Bhairavas were worshipped within the family, within the day-to-day rituals, and within the special occasions like Shivratri. Now, for those who wanted to continue with the spiritual practices, there was another Bhairava which was worshipped in the form of Amriteshwar Bhairava. The Amriteshwar Bhairava temple is within the presence of Ishwara Ashram, which was later made during the times of Swami Lakshmanju Maharaj. So here you can see the Amriteshwar Bhairava holding different, having 4 arms, having Amrit Kalash, lotus, having mudras of Varad and Abhay. So the mention of this Amriteshwar Bhairava is in detailed manner put into the Netra Tantra, and the practitioners of the Kashmir Shaivism were asked by the gurus, okay, and finally they used to see where the seeker has gone in his spiritual practices. So then they used to give the details of this Bhairava to the seeker. Now, the influence of Shaivism. Now, these were the Bhairava worship were in the form of deities and festivals. Now, how this Shaivism percolated or permeated into the Kashmiri society. So here is the few of it. For example, the script. The script contains consonants and vowels. So the Sharda script, which is considered to be the divine in origin, represents that Shiva and Shakti are both consonants and vowels. So these represent the Prakash and Vimarsha aspect. And about this in details, Mahamaheshwaracharya Abhinavgupta mentions about it in Paratramshika, and also in a very esoteric way is mentioned in Malini Vijaya Tantra, which is one of the very dearest Tantra and often quoted by Abhinavgupta in his works. Now, worship of during the marriages, the bride and the groom both are considered as Shakti and Shiva. They were treated as Bhairav and Bhairavi and worshipped. So you can see that it was not that Shaivism was also on a philosophical. So how this metaphysical or esoteric came to the common popular level so that one can understand its real essence was also practiced. As you know that the Kashmiri ladies wear a dejor, a kind of a dangling through the hair, and it is basically a kind of a golden ornament dangling from the ear. This is basically a Siri Yantra, and which represents the Samavesh of Shiv and Shakti. This ornament is not to be confused with the Mangal Sutra, because Mangal Sutra in rest of the country is removed after the demise of the husband. But in Kashmir, the ladies continue to put it because they have done the expansion. They have continued the role of the goddess. So therefore, this yantra was kept on in their ears till they were alive. In birthday rituals, during our ceremonies, which were Hindus in Kashmir followed the lunar calendar, the puja or the practices would be incomplete if you will not worship the Kul Devi and the Kul Bhairava. Just a minute.
Haji, we have to stop it, huh? So band ho gaya na time.
Okay. So I'll just run through quickly from other slides.
Sunil ji, I think we are close to the end.
Okay.
Lane, how much time do we have, Lane?
We do have another panel that's going to get started in here in 5 minutes. So in order to give us enough time to set up, I'd say is it possible to close this in 2 minutes? So we're just running 5 minutes over. So
okay, I'll just run through it. Like Shonaleeka said, the river is considered as the divine origin, this river Jhelum. Similarly, for the Kashmiri folklore, Bandapathar, its origin is said to be from the Shiva Bhagavati, whose temple is at Akingam, Anantnag. There are other goddesses in Kashmir, the primary being the goddess at Tulmula, and other at Badgam, Bhadrakali at Vadipura, Kupwara, at Jwala, at Kriv, and so on other places. Now coming to the Ishwar Ashram. So here is the chronology, like Lord Shiva appeared in the form of Sri Kantha, then 4 schools were there. And these are the various chronology and the acharyas which came in these traditions till it came to Shaivacharya Swami Lakshmanju Maharaj. And then the Swamiji taught this to various disciples across India, and the various ashrams were set up in different parts of the country and abroad, like Alex Sanderson, Mar Diskowski, Swami Muktanand, Rameshwarja, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, all of them visited the Kashmir. There are a lot of material available from the Ishwara Ashram, which one can take and study from. Apart from the traditional lineage, there was another lineage from Laleshwari. She is said to be from the lineage of Vasugupt, and Mata Rupa Bhavani. She has also been guided by Laleshwari subsequently. Then there were other subsequent saints in Kashmir who, on the other, from the direct lineage, continued the practices of Kashmir Shaivism and made it available to the common people. Lastly, there was Sharika Devi ji, one of the disciples of Swami Lakshmanju Maharaj, and Prabha Devi ji, who is the living legend and still surviving and continuing the practice of Kashmir Shaivism among the masses. There were the tirthas in different places of the Kashmir. So all of them can show the continuity, which I initially said that it was the playground of the goddess, which explains how this Kashmir was a sacred land, the topography, culture, everything was permeated and practiced in the Shaivite traditions. This is how I wanted to conclude. Thank you very much, and hope we'll connect sometime in future. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Sunil, that was great. I wish we had more time to go through the slideshow, but there's another session starting in a few minutes. So I don't think we have any time for questions, do we? Lane, I think.
We may have some people on from the other session. So I'd say, I mean, if we want to just answer one really quick question, we are starting in the next 5 minutes. So we'll probably, is there a way to do emailed out questions? Can we email the presenters directly? If you guys drop your emails in the chat, we could always email you directly with any questions. These were beautiful presentations.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I request Subhash ji, Shonaleeka ji, and Sunil, please put your emails in the chat. So I think there's people, also there's Madhu ji who wanted Sunil's contact, and she wants to ask you about Ganpatiyar, where she used to live. So Madhu Pandit, and there are others too. So please, let's just do this. And so yeah, thank you so much, Lane, for having us. And this was wonderful, and hopefully we can do it again sometime. And thank you all for coming. Thank you all for attending. Namaskar. And see you soon. Om Namah Shivaya.
Thank you, Vikram.
Thank you. Thank you all.
So testing.
Talk now, or I guess.
Is that because the echo is up because of the because should I test now? Testing. Om.
Can do.
Does anything while my screen is sharing, so I just can't like speak.
My, I guess I'll be able to see from here.
Awesome.
Yeah,
And
and then
hi.
I'll just switch with you whenever we need to be like,
Okay.
time for next presenter.
Great, it is unmuted, the video is on, so there are people in the waiting room. Welcome, everyone, or they shouldn't be in the waiting
They
room.
shouldn't
We
be
have-
great. They
yeah.
should just come right in.
So
So
we
we're
have
unmuted
24
on here.
Yeah, so
Okay.
the volume and everything, everyone can hear us okay? If you want to drop something in the chat or. Unmute, perfect, we've got a thumbs
So
up.
is that what's, okay, so that's just the PowerPoint up there.
Yeah, this
okay.
is what they're seeing on Zoom.
Okay. Okay.
So,
So I won't,
so
I won't
this
see
is-
who's in the Zoom room or
You
anything
wanna see
for,
them?
yeah, I think that would be,
Oh, wait. That's not gonna work.
okay.
yeah, that'll be okay.
That's
Is
okay?
that- Yeah, that works. I
Okay.
think, and then they'll see.
Yeah, because then if we need
Okay.
to like mute anyone too, we can do that, I think.
Yeah, I'll be signed into this one as well, and I'm a co-host, so I can always help mute.
Okay, yeah,
On
because I
these.
just can't see anything on my laptop.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll keep an eye on muting.
Okay.
Everyone should be admitted. If anything crazy happens, I'll pause You can see some people at least.
Okay. And we're good to go?
We're good to go. You can go
Okay.
ahead and start it. I'm gonna talk
All right,
to you.
we've
Okay, thank you, Liz.
finished the housekeeping. So welcome, everyone. My name is Christine Gabaly, and I'm from Loyola Marymount University. I'm currently working on my master's in yoga studies, part of cohort 9, and in my second semester, and we're deeply immersed in Sanskrit and yoga philosophy and Hatha yoga texts. We spent the first 2 weeks of the program, you could say, on a historical tour of yoga. And one of our first assignments was to write a 15-page paper defining what is yoga. Scholars have written entire books on the subject, so how are we to actually communicate what is yoga in a 15-page paper? But there was a twist. We could define it from our own perspective and our own experience. I came a little later to the yogic path. I spent 20 years in employee benefits. And I think that it's safe to say from a modern perspective, most people walk into a yoga class today not for spiritual experience, at least that first initial class perhaps. But what often happens is that somewhere during the course of time that people are introduced to the subtler aspects of being, and a spiritual doorway, in a sense, opens. And I know that was the case for me. So again, this is not a definition of yoga. This is merely from my own experience. But for me, yoga is more than a mind and body practice. It is a spiritual practice that is experienced through the body and the senses, sight, sound, physical sensation. A lot of scholarship is emphasizing the mind, and the mind as the doorway to spirituality. But I feel as though the senses that are the key to opening that door. Again, so much emphasis is placed upon the mind, the mind, the mind, the mind. But I'd like to offer a counterpart, and that's the heart. And the heart is more than a supporting cast member. Next slide. So we're going to take a look at 2 passages in 2 primary texts, the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali, and the Bhagavad Gita. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, right up front, verse 1.2, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the stilling of the thought waves of the mind, or the restraint of thoughts, or the cessation of thoughts. Yoga's translating to yoga, chitta, the mind, vrittis, thought waves, and nirodha, cessation, restraint. Patanjali also describes the 8 limbs of yoga, the last 3 of which, dharana, concentration, dhyana, meditation, and samadhi, meditative absorption, are all mind-type practices. And the 5th limb of yoga, pratyahara, is the withdrawal of the senses. So it's very clear in Patanjali that the mind is the point of focus, and it's a cessation of senses, a withdrawal of the senses. So let's compare that now to a passage from the Bhagavad Gita. And this particular passage is Krishna's response to Arjuna when he asks what one should do at the hour of death if one wants to be united with Krishna. And this particular translation is by Ethna Isherwan. Remembering me at the time of death, close down the doors of the senses and place the mind in the heart. Then while absorbed in meditation, focus all energy upwards to the head, repeating in this state the divine name, the symbol Om, that represents the changeless Brahman. You will go forth from the body and attain the supreme goal. So the mind is being directed to the heart, energy, prana, is being directed to the head. And the symbol, the mantra Om, is being used to unite with Krishna. The heart becomes the area of focus. And at least at the hour of death, meditation becomes a heart-based practice. And Om, the mantra Om, is a sensory practice. It uses sound, it uses vibration. So it's something that's heard and it's felt. I'd like to share a little story here. I first read this passage, I guess it was around 8 years ago, and it definitely stayed with me. It came back to me again in the summer of 2020. My mother had entered hospice August 12th, and August 15th, she was doing in-home hospice. So I was staying with my mom and sleeping on the sofa opposite my mom's hospital bed in my parents' living room. And then the night of August 15th, I'm at my mom's bedside saying goodnight, getting ready to prepare for bed. And she looked up at me with, the only way I can describe it is the eyes of a scared little girl. And this passage came to me. And I thought, put your thoughts to God. And I was going to verbalize it, but then I'm like, no, she knows this. And literally the next moment, she's lying in bed, places her hands like this, looking towards the ceiling, and then they part without a word. And I think the gesture says everything. And she passed the next morning. So it's not something that we think about on a daily basis, but the moment of transition is one of the most important parts of life. It's that circle of life. And I find it significant that at that moment, that the focus is on the heart and meditation becomes a heart-based practice. Next slide. In Eknath Iswaran goes on to say, when a consciousness has been withdrawn from these gates, Krishna says the mind is placed, locked up in the heart. Here, as in Christian mysticism, it is the heart and not the head that is taken to be the home of the soul. Probably what is meant is the heart chakra, the center of consciousness. It's interesting when we think about the mind and psychology, they have not been able to locate where the mind exists. So I like Robert Thurman. There was a phrase in one of his books that describes Buddhist psychology is a joyous science of the heart. And again, I find that connection to the heart. Philosophers have debated this. Hippocrates, Socrates, and Plato said that the mind, that intelligence existed in the brain, where Aristotle thought that thought existed in the heart. It's interesting more recently from a neuroscience perspective, neuroscientists have discovered that the heart has a nerve plexus that is comprised of neurons that are very similar to those in the brain. And when the heart actually emits electromagnetic waves, and that when functioning well is in sync with the brain. So I find that connection fascinating. Next slide. Meditation is a practice, next one before that. They're just pictures that I've taken. Oh, the one before. The one is the pathway. There. A picture from the University of Washington Arboretum, beautiful place to visit. Meditation is a practice that is found in many world religions. One sits contemplating an aspect of the divine, but what happens next in reality, other thoughts come in, the mind likes being given points of focus. And mantra is a way of focusing your thoughts. Mantra can be a sound, like a beach sound that's associated with one of the chakras. It can be a word that's invoking a deity. It can be a phrase like Om Mani Padme Hum. And again, it's a sensory practice. There's the auditory component, you hear it, and then there's that vibrational component, you feel it. It can be sung, it could be chanted, and chanting is also something that we see in many world religions. You see Hindu, Buddhist, Judaic, Christian, and I first experienced chanting growing up in the Armenian Apostolic Church. Most of the divine liturgy is chanted. And another little story to kind of emphasize the point about feeling and sound. My grandmother passed in 97, my daughter was born in 98, and somewhere during her teenage years when she was in high school, she wanted to experience an Armenian church service. She had heard me speak about this. The closest church was about an hour away from us. And my father, who's Italian, wanted to go. And we hadn't been for a number of years since my grandmother had passed. So we went to Easter service, which is about 3 hours long, most of it standing. And my daughter's next to me and my father's on the other side. And my father only speaks, well, rather, he only knows a few words of Armenian, most of them food related. So the liturgy is done in Armenian. And somewhere during the midst of the chanting and the incense and the ritual aspect, I looked to my father and his eyes are filled with tears and he's overcome with emotion. I get this from my father, but he said to me later, he says, it's the chanting. I mean, he didn't understand a word of the liturgy, but he felt it. And so I think that speaks to the power of sound, and not to get ahead of myself, but the next paper that I'm writing for yoga philosophy is around sound and music, because again, sort of where I'm thinking now that before, I love words and I love philology and translation, but sometimes words fall short or we just can't translate things accurately. But before there was words, and words are a man-made construct, before there were words, there was sound. So I think that's important to note. Going back to in terms of meditation practices, there are other tools that use the sense of sight. Tools such as mandalas, yantras, tankas, and you see church art, stained glass. And this realization came to me when I was writing my paper, when I was thinking about stained glass, because I think back to those days when you're a child and you're in school and your mind wanders and you're looking out the window, maybe distracted by what's going on in the playground. But in a church setting, when you look to the window, there isn't that distraction on what's happening on the outside because of the stained glass. So it lets light in, but it keeps your point of focus. Instead of being distracted by what's going on, you're met by an image, whether it's a saint or a Mary or Jesus or a lamb or a flower. So it's that point of focus that's subtly, gently taking you back to where your point of focus should be. Next slide. So what's also interesting that and it just shows how everything is connected, is that there's the spiritual aspect, but there are other aspects of mantra. And there was an article in Yoga Therapy Today that actually studied the benefits of mantra. One citation they did was for it was the British Medical Journal, and they actually did a study on the use of Om Mani Padme Hum and Ave Maria, the Hail Mary. And what they found that it slowed the breath rate, and that long-term practitioners, actually they found lower blood pressure and higher blood oxygen, brain oxygen saturation, blood oxygen saturation, sorry. And it also cited another study done by Duke, where it showed decreased stress and anxiety and improved moods. So mantra works on the physical and the cognitive level, but it also works on an emotional and a spiritual level. So we can go to the next slide. 5 minutes, okay. All right, and then these are just quickly from around my apartment. I just grabbed different objects that are in my purview and some objects. So meditation can be done using an object such as the dancing Shiva or Ganesha. Next slide. Tanka, as we talked about earlier. This is a painting. I just wanted to stop on this briefly. Painting of Moses holding the tablets. This was a painting by Leonard Sachs, given to me by his daughter Eleni. Also very fascinating, interesting. She's also an artist. Started at this art abandonment project where her father was a prolific painter during his reclusive years, and I think he had 3,000 works, and she was placing them at different places, free art. So she gave me this painting. And the Madonna and Child. Next slide. These are photos taken that I took at Alhambra. And go to the next slide. And then we have going back to the visual component. I originally was going to perhaps play them, but sometimes I know that some people have a sensitivity to the tingsha. So just in case there is anyone out there, I think probably be a better idea to not to play that. So let's talk about sort of what's happening next. So everything seems to be directing my focus, at least for my yoga philosophy class, on a continued study of sound and how that's applied in the spiritual practice. Another quick story. The morning of August 16th, I received a song through Bandcamp, Canary Records, which I highly recommend. Ian Nagoski, he's really more of a music preservationist, focusing on music from the early part of the 20th century, immigrant music. Very interesting. Columbia Records saw that they had this whole audience of these immigrants that had come to the United States. So Armenian 78s, Turkish, Greek, and he's taking these 78s and preserving them. I donated my grandparents' record collection to them. But the song that I received was a song, Suda Suda, which is an Armenian folk song. And well, briefly. Suda Suda Suda, Amen Pan Suda, Ashkarim Mech, Amen Pan Suda. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. There was a song that my grandmother would sing often while washing dishes. The song translates to Suda, Suda, Suda. It's false, it's false, it's false. Amen Pan Suda. In this world, everything is false. Ashkarimech, Amen Pan Suda. In this life, everything is false. When I think about that, I think of Maya, the illusion. I played this song, probably it was around 6:30 a.m. and I was actually afraid of waking up my mother. She made a little sound and I said, I'll play it for her later. And she passed about an hour later. That song, the words, done in so many different ways, so many expressions, but it's that I keep coming back to that the illusion, the Maya, and that in this life, what is real versus what is not. And I keep coming back to that sound exists, and then we could feel it. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time. Any questions? There's one question in the room.
Well, I just want to comment and say, bravo, sister. I think you're right on. It brings to mind the song by John Denver, Annie's song, You Fill Up My Senses. I would encourage everybody to listen to that song at some point today and kind of contemplate everything Christine shared with us. But in the book, The Secret Power of Yoga, Vishala Joy Devi interprets that Yoga Sutra 1.2 as yoga is the uniting of consciousness in the heart. And then the program of HeartMath, where it talks about heart and mind coherence, the benefit of taking a deep breath in as if you're breathing in the prana of the trees into the heart and allowing you to feel calm. So I think there's much to be expressed on the idea of the heart as the true brain. And then the other thing I think we need to recognize is that all of this was interpreted through the lens of the masculine. And as we look at nervous system and the way the embodied masculine is wired as compared to the embodied feminine, the embodied masculine does have enormous chitta. Therefore, the interpretation of yoga needs to be stilling the chitta of the mind, calming the fluctuations of the mind. The new interpretation for the new age, which is perhaps led by the feminine embodiment, is more about the body. And maybe we need to bring back sacred dance as a means of meditation, especially for feminine leadership.
It's interesting that you say that, because in a book by Swami Kavalananda, and he didn't give an explanation why, but it's interesting that he made a distinction between the masculine and the feminine in terms of the practice. I know a lot of lineages, they say no music during a yoga class. But I found it was interesting that Swami Kavalananda said that for women, that music and dance was important. So I think it's important to look at, like, we know that yoga is not a one size fits all practice in any way, whether we're looking at from a physical perspective, a mind perspective, a heart perspective. And I think we need to kind of look at these things from different lenses and what resonates with you. And I think maybe what might resonate with one might not resonate with someone else. And I resonate with music and movement of the body. So, I mean, there's those moments of both. And I also find too, and it makes me think of the Simon and Garfunkel song, The Sounds of Silence. Think about those moments when you're in a bhakti and you're a group chanting, and you have this build up, and then it moves to silence. And that silence is so powerful. It's almost deafening. And even in jazz, some of my favorite musicians, it's the use of the spaces between the notes that I find really fascinating and interesting. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions before we move on to Heather? Again, thank you for your time and allowing me to present my own personal perspective and experience. Thank you.
Hey, Heather, are you ready? Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, hi everyone. Can you hear me? Great, Christine, that was so awesome. All right, let me get my little screen share. Cool. Hi everyone, my name is Heather Romanowski. I am a first-year MA Yoga Studies candidate here at Loyola Marymount University. The title of my paper was Yoga and Disability, Redefining Yoga for Every Body and Mind. So just as we have been attempting to define this term yoga since its inception, the word and situation of disability has struggled to define itself as, like yoga, it's a layered situation. In 2011, the World Report on Disability was released and describes this term disability as complex, dynamic, multidimensional, and contested. Sound familiar? My interest and focus of this paper was on the definition of yoga as skill in action, as interpreted in the Bhagavad Gita, to compare research and investigate the role of yoga therapy in neurodiverse communities. So disability is an umbrella term for impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. Disability refers to the negative aspects of the interaction between individuals with a health condition and personal and environmental factors. These can include negative attitudes, inaccessible transportation or public buildings, and limited social support. So the transition from an individual medical perspective to a structural social perspective was huge. And it's been described as the shift in which people are viewed as being disabled by society rather than by their bodies. The ICF now understands functioning and disability as a dynamic interaction between health conditions and contextual factors, both personal and environmental. Recognized as a biopsychosocial model, this evolving definition allows for mind-body therapies to come into play in a more significant role. So why look at disability? In the 1970s, the World Health Organization estimated that around 10% of the global population lived with some form of disability. In 2010, the number climbed up to about 15% worldwide. 12 years after this paper has come out and these numbers, we can only imagine what they are now. The report stressed that the numbers are only growing and that there are barriers in place that keep it disproportionately affecting susceptible populations. Those that have a higher risk of disability include the elderly, those from lower income countries, lower income, out of work and low education persons, and women. Although the historical context of yoga has led it to adapt and evolve over time, with increased opportunities to access for some, other communities of persons with physical or mental disabilities appear to encounter more obstacles than access. Persons with disability often need multiple therapies and interventions to alleviate core symptoms. The non-invasive nature of yoga therapy makes parents of neurodiverse children more willing to try it as part of a combination of therapies or interventions for relief of symptoms. A systematic review of mind-body therapies and persons with autism spectrum disorder found that there just was not enough research being conducted in this field. They found that about 30% of persons with ASD are practicing some form of mind-body therapy, yet parents could not be specific about why they're helping their children. So we have proof that the number of persons living with disabilities is growing. The problem's not getting any better by ignoring it. So the focus on this subject has not been very consistent or well documented in the past, but the challenge now is to bridge that by practicing compassion. So while the focus on physical postures of yoga are not the primary goal when practicing with persons with disabilities, that's not to say that there's not countless physical health benefits specifically targeting ailments associated with or byproducts of disability. Children with ASD typically display decreased coordination, body awareness, and sensory integration. Yoga therapy helps improve all these physical areas. Persons with Down syndrome can have increased flexibility, hypermobile joints, and increased weight leading to joint pressure. Strengthening poses helps with these, while stretches allow them to excel with safe boundaries and build self-esteem. Competitive physical outlets can be frustrating with a disability, so yoga is non-competitive and it provides an environment where risk-taking and self-confidence can increase, especially in children. Creating spaces to be physical, and empower them to be able to relate to others more easily as a result. And research reinforced findings of improved quality of life. Yoga therapy aligns with the intentions of yoga as skill in action. We should remember that even Arjuna was conflicted in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna reminds him that if he can establish himself in yoga, in unshakable equanimity, profound peace of mind, he will be more effective in the realm of action. We further receive the advice that on this path, effort never goes to waste and there's no failure. This ideology forms a foundation for the practices of yoga therapy today. The yoga becomes about meeting the client where they are, practicing compassion, and helping the individual reevaluate and appreciate their relationship with their body and mind. The philosophy presented in the 5th century sets a tradition of what the practice of yoga is and why we should do it. The research conducted and science established since then has helped to redefine what practices are therapeutic for modern context. This marriage of the original message, clarified through refinement of practices over hundreds of years, leads us to an excellent opportunity to pair ancient wisdom with modern applications. The benefits of this wisdom need to be shared, though, not just with those that it comes easiest to, but those that could find the greatest successes through its challenges. With yoga, the real experiments need to lie in the practice. The way to best integrate persons with disabilities into our communities is to have conversations with them. We know about skills proven to benefit all persons being more sustainable, compassionate, kinder members of their communities. Yoga therapy and a sincere invitation to be in community with other humans practicing compassion could lead to those with disabilities sitting longer, to engage with us on strategies for more efficient policies on inclusivity. By utilizing the approaches of yoga therapy and persons with varying needs, we're empowering those members of the community with skills that focus on what they are capable of, their ability to do yoga and be in relationship. Interventions that build skills like these can lead to better social interactions in the community and at home with parents, siblings, nurses, caretakers. Better focus and emotional regulation could help individuals that struggle to hold a job. The ability to sit still for periods of time and self-regulate relaxation breaks and learning could lead to increased success in educational settings. And my favorite research reason was your unconditional presence and acceptance of each child teaches loving kindness through example. That is where the real healing happens. Remember, there is no failure. The only way that we are doing harm is by remaining stuck in the traditions and practices that hold back fellow humans from reaching their full potential in this realm and in the greater role in the cosmic order. And this was my favorite quote that I found in my research. You might think that an advanced practitioner is the person who can perform the most extreme position or a very difficult pose. In reality, an advanced practitioner is one who practices each pose, no matter how simple or difficult, to the limits of their ability and with full awareness plus a quiet mind, and then brings that inner knowledge into the daily world. I appreciated this interpretation of yoga as it's inclusive enough to allow entry into the tradition by anyone truly willing to do the work. So what next? My argument is that there is no yoga body, no trainable mind. The person that did not have to face any challenges or overcome disabilities in their liberation may not be my most relatable teacher. The person that struggles to find harmony in their mind and body, but does so despite challenges they were born into, is a person I think I can learn something from. There are skills that must be taught through relationship and in conversation. I will not argue that. I will argue that we make it difficult sometimes to learn from these exceptional humans and their inherent value when we don't give them the spaces to be in community and be heard. If part of our collective dharma is to minimize suffering, we should be having conversations with those that are suffering, learning from them, celebrating their triumphs, and sharing any way that we know how to practice decreasing disease. One of the concluding recommendations of the World Report on Disability was that the way to best integrate persons with disabilities into our communities is to have conversation with them. They note that people with disabilities often have unique insights about their lives and therefore need to be consulted on issues that concern them directly, whether in health, education, rehabilitation, or community living. Yoga therapy and a sincere invitation to be in community with other humans practicing compassion could lead to those with disabilities sitting longer to engage with us on strategies for more efficient policies on inclusivity. This leads us to look at wider implications of increased inclusivity and involvement in the conversation by other alienated communities. Inclusivity of marginalized groups may lead to decreased cases and disability in the future trends if we implement the right practices now. Even if that does not become the situation, at the very least, it will lead those with disabilities practicing yoga to benefit from physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of a practice that will lead them to being more functional persons in society. At the very most, it will lead to a Sangha comprised of all the faces of divinity that exist on this earth. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Are there any questions for Ms. Heather?
Great.
All right, if there are no questions or insights, points of discussion, we will move on to our next presenter, who is Ms. Francesca Gold. No questions?
It was a wonderful presentation. Great. I appreciate it. Rohini.
Okay, so Francesca has a recorded video, so I'll get that up. Share screen.
Hello, good morning. My name is Francesca Gold, and I'm so sorry I cannot be there with you live, but I'm happy to be making this recording right now to share my research with you. I am a graduate student at Loyola Marymount University, writing my thesis right now, and thank you so much to Dr. Chappell for inviting me to present, and Dr. Miller for encouraging me to do this research. As you might be able to tell, I'm sick, I'm not really feeling well, and completely lost my voice a few days ago. So I have a throat lozenge and some tea here. And we'll just see how my voice holds up for this presentation, but please bear with me, and thank you so much again for being here and being interested in my research. One of the reasons I'm not able to be present this weekend is I'm actually facilitating a 3-day retreat at the Krishnamurti Foundation, and Krishnamurti's work has had a deep influence on me, and it's allowed me to really think about things and ponder subjects deeply, complex subjects at that, while genuinely just asking questions, just getting to the nature of things, the root of things. And so I would definitely attribute that to why I'm researching what I'm researching. So this project really started in the fall of 2021 in Dr. Christopher Miller's History of Modern Yoga class. We were instructed to conduct ethnographic research for our final project, and I chose to focus on a community that I've been a part of for many years. So one of the primary objectives of this History of Modern Yoga course was to answer how forms of contemporary yoga practiced today are connected to pre-modern forms of yoga developed in India. And so, seeing as I was already a certified yoga therapist, CIAYT, through the International Association of Yoga Therapists, did a whole 1,000+ hour program through LMU. I actually was almost grandfathered into the certification, but I'm so glad that I did the training. This is an area of interest to me, right? So that was kind of the starting point, and I knew I wanted to research yoga therapy. I was first introduced to this Pañcamayakośa model in 2010, so about 12 years ago, through the Himalayan Institute. So I decided to dig a little bit deeper into what we call yoga therapy. Sometimes I refer to it as modern yoga therapy. It's interchangeable. And I wanted to know more about the history of it specifically, seeing as this was a history of modern yoga class, right? So I wanted to understand the recent success of it in healthcare in the past decade and decades. And personally, I'm someone who has utilized yoga, meditation, self-inquiry, all of this, lifestyle changes for many, many, many years, all of my adult life and through my adolescence as well, to overcome tremendous personal challenges. So this research is close to my heart. It's not, this intellectual just kind of game for me. So yoga therapy, if you're not familiar, I'm going to just read the definition from IAYT. So it's the professional application of the principles and practices of yoga to promote health and well-being within a therapeutic relationship. It includes personalized assessment, goal setting, lifestyle management, and yoga practices for small groups or for individuals. So the part of this definition that I wanted to investigate was the personalized assessment aspect. So pretty much every yoga therapist I know, and I don't know them all, of course, but the ones I know use the Pañcamaya model as in their assessments and as part of their assessments. I had been told by my yoga therapy teachers that this model came from the Taittiriya Upanishads, but when I read the text, translated, of course, even though we do study Sanskrit in the graduate course, when I read the text, the word kosha wasn't actually in the Upanishads, and that was in my yoga philosophy class maybe 2 years ago. And so, like I mentioned, my upbringing was built on just this curiosity and wondering. I was just curious about it, wanting to connect the dots. So I decided to do my project on this and dig a little bit deeper. So I knew I wanted to get other people's insights and not just do my own research, but I really wanted other people who were using this model as well, my peers. So, pardon me. I got Institutional Review Board, IRB approval through LMU, And this ensures the safety and protection of human and animal subjects involved in any research that we do. It's actually a really long process and includes training on proper research techniques. It's a long application, and you need to get approval from your department chair as well as the IRB committee. So I received approval to do this research. So my research question examines the historical origins of the Pañcamaya model. It's widely used within the yoga therapy sphere. And I had the original question of who developed this model as a modern or just as a yoga therapy assessment tool or just assessment, and how did it become this kind of touchstone for yoga therapy, right? Another question, why have certain practices, philosophies, even personalities stayed at the forefront of our minds as we're modern day practitioners? And so a little bit of an overview of the model itself. You can just simply look up, what are the 5 koshas? You can go ahead and do that right now if you want while you're listening. I'm not going to go into that. But we do see seeds of reference to this in the Upanishadic literature. And we know that the Upanishads are a guiding philosophy for life. They're based in Sankhya and Vedantic ideals. We know that Upanishad is something like to sit next to, to sit near to. So it's really beautiful in that way, I think. So personally, this makes me just think of 2 friends, if you will, sitting together discussing, how to deal with suffering, just as one specific example. So let's see. History of this model. So getting into a little bit of the nitty-gritty here, and this is all just going to be a snapshot of my research. But beyond what's listed of the koshas in James Mallinson's and Mark Singleton's Roots of Yoga book in the 8th or 9th century Advaita Vedantic text, written in the form of a poem, the Vivekachudamani, which is attributed to be authored by Shankaracharya. In verse 164, it explains how identification with the body is a source of misery, and the reader is advised to destroy it with utmost care and to avoid rebirth. So it's mentioned here. In the next verse, that was 164, now in 165, it talks about prana. We know prana is energy, basically. When coupled with the 5 organs of action, it forms the vital sheath, Pranamayakośa, or the prana kosha. This sheath is permeated by the Annamaya, the material sheath, and it's explained how this phenomenon gives appearance to the body being alive, and it's really just prana animating it through speech, which is obviously a challenge for me right now. Manual activity, locomotion, moving, excretion, and reproduction. The next 45 verses, so 166 and 45 verses after that, go into more detail regarding these 5 sheaths. And finally, verse 210 explains how once the sheaths are eliminated, as I mentioned earlier, how Atman, or the true self, is revealed. So the takeaway from this, for simplicity's sake, is that the goal from the perspective of this text is to eliminate identification with each sheath one by one in a methodical way, and to reveal our true selves. Pardon me. So that's the first time kosha is mentioned, and kosha is mentioned in more places as well. It's in my research. I'm not going to go into the specifics of that right now. So I also talk a little bit about the history of yoga therapy. And just to really briefly summarize it, I talk about Yogendra and Kuvalyananda. I also talk about the German nature cure. Gandhi was a big fan of this. And Yogendra in particular, Sri Yogendra and Kuvalyananda, they don't get talked a lot about in the history of yoga therapy at all. In fact, they were not mentioned at all in my 1,000-hour training, and I just want to give proper notice to them. And I make connections to what their work did and what their research did, their experiences, how it supports modern yoga therapy. So what did my research find? So at the time, last semester, I interviewed 12 certified yoga therapists like myself. Since then, I've interviewed a few more, and that'll be in my final thesis, what some others have said. I've purposely have tried to go out to get a lot of different viewpoints, because what happened last semester was actually 100% of the people I interviewed used this model. 50% of them had been yoga therapists for less than 5 years. We know it's a new profession, right? Less than 10% of them had been practicing for more than 16 years. Over 45% of them more than 4 years. Most of them are in practice as a yoga therapist, meaning that they actually do this for a living. And 100% of them, again, use this model in their intakes. I'd say most of them, I think it was almost all but two of them, the people that I researched, had some knowledge of where this model came from. The others did not. Okay, so some final points here. I have a couple points to make. I do think that this research is important to do, and to kind of close the gaps a little bit, kind of bridge the conversation that I think that we need to be having in our field right now. So from a big picture perspective, this is the next logical step for this integrated, somewhat globally inspired holistic medicine that we're practicing. So, and also for reference, I mentioned it's a newer field in the way that it's being practiced now. Psychotherapy and physical therapy are about 100 years old, give or take. And modern yoga therapy, and you can check the IAYT website, is about 30 years old. So this emerging modern yoga therapy profession, it's here to stay. That's my personal opinion. I think it's needed, and I'm going to share a little bit about how I'm integrating it into my community after I present here. I suspect that just like in modern yoga in general, this identity crisis, there's a complex history, these ongoing conversations that we definitely need to have about appropriation, correct applications. These conversations should continue, and I think with that also accurate historical information as well. I'd also like to note that there are no specific yoga therapy tools that are standardized. It is my hope in just starting to do this research and reporting on this research that this field is ushered forward in meaningful ways. There is a note, a voice I think that should be offered here of not wanting to standardize intakes, because then it's not personalized. So that's also that's the other side of the argument here. And really, I see my role right now as sort of just presenting both sides and trying to explain it to the best of my ability. I'll also note that when people study these tools in psychotherapy or in physical therapy, you study the background and the theory of these and the people who founded these assessments, and we know the history of it a lot more. We know how far back these tools go. You know, is it 2,500 years? Like a lot of people say that this model is, or is it not? And my research definitely goes into that and examines that narrative. There are some cases that unless you have a license for an assessment, you cannot even use that assessment. So some examples, the MMPI, you can Google all this, SA, SSI, BDI, BA. There's a lot of assessment tools used in other in licensed professions, sorry, that they're regulated. And again, I'm presenting this information. I think it's interesting to present it all, and hopes of opening conversation about it. Little bit more about my research in particular. So the absence of the word koshas, is it a case of semantics? That's one argument I got. And okay, what if it's not just semantics, I ask as well. What if this, pardon me, what if, this is a question for us all to hold, what if this desire for antiquity, and therefore if something's ancient, you know, there's a greater authenticity to it, what if it's pushed the date of this model back 2,500 years ago when really kosha is only mentioned 400 years ago? And I go into detail on this. Which one sounds more impressive? You know, oh, I'm using this model from 2,500 years ago, or I'm using this model from 400. 400 is still a long time. And why do we need it to be older? That's a question I have. Also, I just want to mention Pañcamayakośa or Pañcamaya or Pañcamayakośa, however you say it. It just sounds so beautiful. It's a beautiful, I mean, Sanskrit, Hindi, they're both beautiful languages. Main Hindi Sikh Rahi Hu, I'm learning to speak Hindi. It's so beautiful to hear, to listen to speak, to learn. I think saying, you know, oh, this is the model I use, I think it's really, it just rolls off the tongue. It's very sexy in a sense, right? So that's a note that came up for me. And a genuine question I have is antiquity and familiarity with something that is ancient, is that what marks a good yoga therapist? And as Amanda Lucia asks in one of her recent books that's come out, wouldn't just being a good yoga therapist make you a good yoga therapist? We don't need this tie to antiquity, or do we? Do you? As expressed in my research findings, many of the participants use this model because it's what they were taught to do. Some expressed that they did have a desire to learn the roots of the model, but only 2 mentioned that they knew where it could be found. Nobody named any other source text other than the Taittiriya Upanishad. Applications of such information to the profession of yoga therapy reveals, in my opinion, perhaps yours too, just a weakness in the greater yoga therapy community. And a weakness doesn't have to be a bad thing. There's plenty of times when someone's pointed out a weakness to me and it's become my greatest strength. So there's a gap in perhaps there's a gap in just motives of yoga therapists wanting to understand the depth from which their training has come from, and then taking action steps to doing so. So what I mean to say is, in my research, a lot of yoga therapists said they honored the tradition, you know, appropriation, not appropriating was very important to them, but there was this gap in then taking action. And I'm wondering, is the gap because we don't know how to access source texts? Is it lack of time? Is it lack of confidence? What is the reason? I think it's also important to note, take the therapist part of yoga therapists quite seriously. Is this a body denying model? You know, I opened with explaining how the idea was to, I don't know if obliterate is too strong of a word, but move through each of the koshas and unidentify with them. And this is the practice of neti, not this, not that, right? So this body denying model. And is this how does this fit into modern yoga therapy? And we're familiar a little bit, hopefully at this point, all with spiritual bypassing and the danger in that, especially when we're dealing with trauma. So let's see, I know I'm getting to time here. I want to mention too, really important, one participant shared about a physician that she knows who learned about this model from her, and that physician felt that all healthcare providers ought to utilize this perspective to shift client communications and consider clients in a broader approach. So that means that there's something to this approach. I like this approach. In my research, I go into some case studies and a little bit more of just my engagement with the kosha model. There does seem to be a disconnect between the vision of yoga therapy and the ability to integrate and accurately integrate, this textually relevant information into trainings, into scholarly articles, into client education. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. If you're watching this, please reach out. I'm hopeful that this is not the case and will not always be the case. Like I said, I'm a yoga therapist in practice. I just opened up a yoga studio in Ojai, California, Southern California. And that leads into my next portion. So I just opened up a studio. It's called Breathe Ojai. And it is a sliding scale. So pay what you can. There's no gatekeeping. Trauma informed. All of our teachers have trauma training. Accessible. So I know there's another presenter here talking a little bit about accessible yoga and working with disabilities. So yes, all of the above. And of course, then I bring in my yoga therapy aspect to it. And Breathe also takes on the form of a community hall. So we have 12-step meetings there. We have support groups of many different kinds. I call it, it's yoga for people who aren't yoga people. I mentioned we are in a self-inquiry and yoga retreat right now, diving into the questions of what is yoga, what is Sankhya philosophy, how does that intersect with what Krishnamurti teaches, which is very Advaitic, Vedantic kind of work. We were just talking about that earlier today, duality and non-duality. We have an anxiety and panic disorder support group. I do work with a licensed psychotherapist on that. We have community yoga therapy clinics. So people can sign up at an extremely reduced cost of what I normally charge for my one-on-one sessions and leave with actual practical tools to make lifestyle changes. Of course, community satsangs and kirtans. We have a book club right now. We are reading Jivana Haven's Yoga Revolution book. And we are just excited, really excited for his new book. We have yoga for people in recovery. I'm a member of the recovery community almost 7 years. Knock on wood. Oh, that was my little dog over there. So we offer that. And we also I'm offering self-regulation tools for codependency and relational trauma. And this was something else that came out of my graduate work with Dr. Fazio. And of course, some teacher trainings, and many years down the road, I'm hopeful, yoga therapy trainings as well. So I know I'm a little bit over time here. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that my voice came through clearly, and please reach out. You can email me. You can go to breatheojai.com, look us up online. If you're ever in Ojai, come and visit us. And I just hope that this research and the work that we're all doing here leads us all to a place of deep sacredness and just shared unity in this vision of bringing these teachings in all their forms and whatever we call them to life in a living, breathing way. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your conference. Bye.
Okay. Thank you to Francesca. Yes, unfortunately, she's not here to answer questions, but definitely feel free to email her, look into her community hall / yoga studio. If anyone has any insights to share, any closing remarks, definitely feel free to do so. Otherwise, we can end a bit early.